Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. So yesterday I said that I would be talking about the history of indigenous slavery today, and we're going to talk a bit about indigenous Canadian slavery today, and then we're going to talk about further injustices tomorrow. There's so much terrible history with regards to how we've treated the natives that I had to split it up into two parts: pre Confederation and post Confederation. So today is going to be pre Confederation, which deals mostly with slavery and with the start of what would become the reserve system. So, while it's true that the natives had enslaved other natives from warring tribes, it still wasn't the same kind of chattel slavery that we associate with the American Deep South. So let's just keep that in mind going into this. But it's still slavery. It is still the lifelong enslavement of a person and treating them as property to be exchanged and not giving them many rights. So, with that in mind, let's jump into it. Um, so, at first, when New France was settled, this is when the various settlers were first exposed to indigenous systems of slavery, and the French ended up pretty much co-opting the indigenous system, at least at first. It was really only adopted in earnest in 1632, however. And this was also interesting because while slavery was prohibited back in mainland France, it was allowed in their colonies in order to provide the necessary massive amounts of labor that were needed for land clearing, for construction, for working on farms. So they used indigenous slaves for a lot of this labor. There were a few black slaves that had eventually started making their way over to what we now call Canada. But when the British conquered New France in 1759, there were about 3,600 slaves in New France at that time, two-thirds of which were indigenous. Um, and this is the term for indigenous slaves are Pawnees, and initially in the last video I had said that that came from Panashwaga. That was incorrect on my part. It actually comes from Panismahas, which was a subtribe of one of the Pawnee-related peoples in the American Midwest. And the the problem with this is that indigenous slaves were slowly replaced with um, African slaves over time, because of course indigenous slaves that were traded with the French by their native allies, a lot of these slaves came from the interior or more remote parts of the continent, so they did not have immunity to European diseases, and they didn't have any resistance to them. This is why the average age of an indigenous slave in New France was 14 years old. So yeah, that's part of our history right there. Let's just bring slaves in because we need them to clear land and build our buildings and work our farms for us. And they're teenagers and they're dying very young because we don't have a real understanding of German disease theory in the 16 and 1700s. So that's the main history of slavery in New France, which of course did continue in the 1700s until the British abolished the slave trade in 1807, but slaves were not freed until August 1st, 1834. So slavery continued up until that point, but it was slowly replaced by black slaves, which they found as more fitting for doing the work and had resistance to European diseases. Yay. So what happens now? Because now we're not enslaving natives, we still need to deal with them in some way. And this is where our history starts to get even more sinister and horrifying. So there's this part of our history where um, like slave ownership in New France was not legally recognized at the time. Um, but if a native had traded you a gift and that gift happened to be a person, that was fine because you weren't enslaving the person, but they were already enslaved and it happened to be a gift. Technical loophole, basically, is how a lot of this worked. And at one point it gets really bad because the French in New France wanted to mimic the success of slavery in the British colonies, especially the Deep South. So the royal administration gave in to local French Canadian pressures for slave purchasing, and they issued the Raudot Ordinance of 1709, which pretty much put a law legitimizing slavery in the St. Lawrence Valley. And this, of course, did not change until much later with the abolition of slavery in 1834. Now, this also caused problems because now it meant that the French had an economic interest to seek out slaves. And this led to several conflicts and wars and raids, along with their native allies, purely for acquiring slaves from other tribes. This is one famous such example is in the Fox Wars, which took place in what's now the lower peninsula or panhandle, whatever you want to call it, of Michigan, like the main part of Michigan where like Lansing, Ann Arbor, and Detroit all are. We basically went on slave raids to get more slaves so we could try and have more economic industry like the British had, because again, we're talking about New France at this point. So yeah, that's part of it, and that's pretty horrifying. And then when we eventually get rid of slavery, we then decide that we still need to deal with and control the natives. And this is where the reserve system starts to come into play. Now, the greatest problems with the reservation system and the follow-up residential school system definitely involve post-Confederation Canadian history. So what we should be trying to focus on right now is the history of what happened to other Indigenous peoples in Eastern Canada before Confederation, which brings us to talk about the Beothuk for a little bit. Now, the Beothuk don't really exist anymore. They do have some descendants in Indigenous communities in parts of northeastern Quebec and Cape Breton Island, Prince Edward Island, parts of the Maritimes. But they were the original Indigenous inhabitants of the island of Newfoundland. And initially, they had kind of had this peaceful coexistence with the earliest European settlers, because all the earliest European settlers were doing on the island of Newfoundland were setting up fishing posts so that they could go, hunt whales, catch a great big bounty of fish, and then haul their catches back to Europe. And then the natives would sort of go back, see what they could scavenge from their abandoned campsites, etc. But when settlement began in earnest in the 1700s, the Beothuk began to retreat inland, which was not good for them because most of their diet involved the seasonal migration of animals, as well as subsistence off of the oceans along coastal settlements. So by retreating to the interior, they ultimately started to face starvation and die, but it also didn't help matters that the earliest European settlers there saw them as savages, and actually went out hunting some Beothuk for sport or for safety reasons. These various factors, along with, again, a lack of resistance to European diseases, ultimately led to the Beothuk being declared extinct by the 1820s. Now, there are the issues of reservations, because what happened back in the day after New France was conquered by the British, there was the Royal Proclamation line, and this was listed as one of the intolerable acts in the American Revolution, which they said was a great, terrible grievance. The Proclamation Act established the Proclamation Line, which said that all land west of the Appalachian Mountains was supposed to be reserved solely for indigenous use. As we know, this never ended up happening, but this is also the start of the reservation system. So proper reserves start to be proclaimed by various colonial governments through orders in council, where they set aside land for natives to use, and they usually did so in a very undemocratic fashion and without consulting native people. And this is why, up until the 70s, the 80s, and in some cases the 90s, certain native bands and councils in eastern Canada didn't get the rights to their own land until the late 20th century because of some of these earlier attempts at what were pretty much the earliest form of reserves for living, hunting, fishing, trapping, or for spiritual needs of the various tribes that were living in these various areas. And this is really just scratching the surface of our horrifying history against our indigenous population. Between, early slavery of indigenous peoples, which results in them dying at a horrifyingly high rate of mortality, to the point that the average age of an indigenous slave in New France was 14 years old. And then we have, again, the restriction on their land titles and forcing them off their lands into areas that are not well suited to human habitation, and exposing them to disease and suffering and poverty. And that's also just so depressing that even by, the 1830s, one such indigenous people, the Beothuk, had pretty much been rendered extinct. And we're only just getting started with the horrifying history of violence, racism, and discrimination against indigenous peoples. And ultimately, that's what's bothering me today.